Hello and welcome. My name is Raj Persaud and I'm a consultant psychiatrist based in London. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Chris Walsh, who's written a wonderful book entitled Cowardice, A Brief History. And the book is published by Princeton. Chris Walsh is Associate Director of the College of Arts and Sciences Writing Program at Boston University and has also taught at Emerson College, Harvard University. And basically, I'm going to be chatting to Chris today a bit about his book. And the book is an exploration of the concept of cowardice, particularly from a historical standpoint. One of the points that Chris makes right at the beginning of the book is that the notion of cowardice seems to have come back. There's been a resurgence of interest in it in public discourse, maybe in modern times starting from the time of the Twin Towers disaster of 9/11, when an argument seemed to break out in the media in America about whether the terrorists who flew the planes into the Twin Towers could be labeled as cowards. Chris, could you say a bit about that debate and the relevance of it to this notion of cowardice that you're exploring in your book?
Sure. I would say that it wasn't so much the idea of cowardice that came back as the label. It was you didn't hear much about cowardice, but you heard a lot about cowards and what cowards the 9/11 terrorists were, and so it was a term of abuse that was in favor, and a few. I guess brave souls objected to the misuse of the term, and then came outrage from people who really didn't want to be speaking strictly at such a terrible time in the nation's history. And the most prominent case was a man named Bill Maher. His television show had to go off the air.
Because he raised a question about whether it was really right to say that the terrorists were cowards.
Right. He said, call them what you will, but flying an airplane into a building is not cowardly. And on the whole, I think he was right. That is, cowardice is a failure to do something you should do, a duty, because of excessive fear. And it's possible with some mental gymnastics that aren't totally false to think of those men as cowardly. They had, in a way, the cowardice of their convictions, but that's not the way people meant it. They meant those people were somehow weak and scared, and really what they meant was they were evil villains.
And that's the point that you make in your book, which is that one of the worst things you could call someone throughout history appears to be a coward. So we reserve the term coward or cowardice for our enemies. Why is it such a terrible thing in your view? Maybe the lowest thing or the worst thing you could say about someone throughout history seems to be to call them a coward.
Yeah, and there's ample evidence for that. And I think it's in part because of the terrible cost of cowardice. I quote in the book George Washington taking over the Continental Army in 1775 and having to court-martial somebody for cowardice and calling it a crime, the worst crime, because it sometimes happens that the cowardice of a single officer can lead to the destruction of a whole army. And that's there's an example of that in ancient Greek literature. We see it even in Beowulf. Just this idea that the single coward's cowardice can create a panic that then can create mayhem and destruction. It's true that other kinds of vices, for instance, recklessness on the opposite end of the spectrum as far as Aristotle was concerned and others, where if cowardice is an excess of fear, recklessness is a deficit in fear and an excess of confidence. Reckless people can cause terrible harm too, but there's something self-limiting about recklessness. The enemy will correct the reckless soldier, but the cowardly soldier is checked in theory, only by the strength of his legs. And I think the other reason that cowardice is so despised is that it's compare it to, say, somebody who's a traitor and who stabs you in the back. A terrible act, of course, and if we're talking about in the nation state stabbing the president, killing the president or whatever, it can cause as much damage as cowardice. But at least the traitor does something. Whereas the coward proverbially is all he's trying to do is make himself absent.
So it's been a kind of label that we reserve for our enemies, to label them cowardly. But in a society, the cost of cowardice is defeat by the enemy, because if your soldiers turn and run through cowardice, then it's got pretty terrible implications. So there's a sense in which society has to be vigilant for cowardice and kind of stamp it out throughout history, it seems like.
Yes. And they're, from Roman practices of decimation, where 1 in 10 soldiers from a cowardly unit would be executed, to the 20th century, where tens of thousands of Russian and German soldiers were executed for cowardice and desertion in World War II. It's yes, and then not just executions, but all sorts of shaming practices intended to keep men, and typically men, from behaving in a cowardly way.
Now, the book is full of very detailed analyses of some particularly important specific cases. Now, you mentioned the case of Samuel Clements in the 1860s in the US. Tell us a bit about his case and why it's important.
His case drew my attention because it was so heart-wrenching. He was a soldier who, in 1864, had joined the service and had been, he said, tricked into joining. He was sick when his unit first went down from Maine down to Virginia, where it was going to see battle, and he came down late. And almost as soon as he arrived, he skedaddled, and about 6 months later was found living off the land a few miles away from the front lines, and he was arrested. And in his testimony, his final statement in his defense, he said he gave his story, and it seemed like quite a believable story, that he was about 10 years older. He was 53 years old, having lied about his age to get in the service. He was addicted to intemperance. He said, that is, he was an alcoholic. He had been injured in the head and the foot in working in a furniture factory, and he was feeble-minded. All this in this letter written by his representative, and all this testimony delivered to the court-martial, and he was, in any case, convicted of cowardice and shot to death. And I bring up that case because, in part, to show how little mitigating circumstances could matter when it came to cowardice, a charge of cowardice. Even as I show that in the Civil War, in the American Civil War, we saw the first glimpses of a kind of diagnostic or psychological approach to failures of conduct in the face of fear in battle, but certainly Clements didn't benefit from that kind of enlightened thinking, and it really had to wait until World War I and the concept of shell shock that concept, a psychological approach, a therapeutic approach to what previously would have been called cowardice comes into play.
Yes, and your book very clearly documents, very intriguingly documents, the changing way in which we think about cowardice, and you move towards the end of the 20th century and discuss the medicalization of it, and the way it becomes a therapeutic issue. But before we get to that, there's a leaping forward from Clements about 100 years to the Second World War and General Patton. There's a very famous example you give of Patton remonstrating and physically abusing some soldiers because of their cowardice,
Right.
and Patton himself ends up getting into trouble, which again kind of really symbolizes the way thinking had changed about cowardice. Could you say a bit about that case? It's a very famous case.
Sure. Yeah, and there were and immortalized in the 1970 film as well, starring George C. Scott, which shows him just slapping one soldier and telling him he's a coward. In fact, Patton had done it twice, and it became a huge controversy in World War II once it came to light, and Patton was basically taken out of the field and not given a command for almost a year after that happened. And it's an attitude that, while he's the great American representative of a kind of resistance to the therapeutic, it's an attitude that endures, and I kind of trace it in the book to where you still see soldiers who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder feeling that they should not admit it because it's a sign of weakness, it's a sign of cowardice.
I want to stay with the General Patton case because if I remember correctly in the book, one of the soldiers he abused many years later commented that he thought Patton himself was under some kind of strain,
right,
and was quite sympathetic in his analysis of what Patton was up to. He mentions that Patton, there had been a big battle, it hadn't gone well, there were a lot of wounded, Patton had just come from visiting the wounded,
right.
Many of these were seriously wounded men, maybe Patton was a bit shaken up,
right.
and then maybe he got really angry because he was a bit overwrought to think about other soldiers not facing up to battle, claiming, some kind of psychological dysfunction, and therefore they were kind of big wussies as far as Patton was concerned. So I thought that the soldier gave a very sympathetic and psychological analysis of Patton's mental state at the time.
Yeah, I think you're right. I also think Patton would have been outraged at it. That is, he would have said, yes, I had been visiting with troops in that same hospital where these two cowards were, and that's what made me mad. True, but it made me mad because these men who claimed to be suffering from battle fatigue were saying that other men that they would rather that other men face the danger that they weren't willing to face. But you're right. I think there was an interview in the 1970, and Patton had died in 1945, but that by 1970, I think there were fewer Pattons around. That a more medicalized view of this matter was in the ascendant.
Now, one of the other things that you talk about in the book is that it may be that although cowardice is a very important concept, it's the fear of being labelled a coward that has produced a lot of behaviour that may have been unhelpful. It may be the fear of being labelled a coward that leads our leaders to recklessly enter wars, which they should actually be a bit more cautious about. So that our terror, because it's the term is so full of opprobrium, it's our reaction to it that gets us into trouble. We start wars when actually we should be a bit more cautious. Could you say something about that idea? Because it seems very important to me and kind of emblematic of the fact that people who try to argue against wars have more difficulty because they're always in danger of being labelled as cowards.
Right. Yeah, and I think that the history of the world would be a less bloody one were it not for that fear of being cowardly. And it's really easy to find examples. Name a war, and typically you can find in the run-up to the war that, as you say, people who were against it, people who were, even maybe not even pacifists, but simply reluctant or less reluctant than the common folk or than the powerful folk would be labeled cowards. And in one prominent example I give in the book is Lyndon Johnson in the early days of the American involvement in Vietnam, saying, if I left that war, people would think me an unmanly man, and that I was a coward, and so he escalated in a huge way the American involvement in Vietnam, and we know how that turned out. And you can just look at World War I. I quote the Remarque novel All Quiet on the Western Front, in which he says, from the perspective of a young man, that everybody was ready with the word coward. Nobody had the slightest idea what we were in for. And so you see it on the level of soldiers in the street, or just people in the street, and soldiers going off to war, not wanting to be seen to be cowardly, and so fighting, so making the charge, crossing no man's land. And you see it among leaders as well, who, after all, are human beings, typically men who have this ingrained in them, this contempt for cowardice, or the fear of being cowardly. You also see it quite apart from the military context, in crime. The fear of seeming cowardly in a street gang has driven has been behind many a murder and other kinds of violence.
There's a famous Harvard anthropologist called Wrangham who makes the point that there are only two species on the planet that go to war. These are ants and human beings. And he believes that one of the reasons for that is in the rest of nature, when two animals face off and they're about to have a fight, generally speaking, there's a lot of display and threat, but basically one of the animals backs down in the end, because that animal works out that it's probably going to lose the fight. And it's this backing down that you see a lot of in the rest of nature, which we don't do as humans, and that's why we end up fighting each other. And Wrangham is saying that usually when two armies go to war, the army that loses and the side that loses is normally devastated and suffers massively, much more so than if they had avoided war in the first place. So one of the problems that Wrangham is pointing out is that if we could back down a bit more, actually it would be helpful. But maybe one of the points your book is making, and I think one of its great contributions, is the reason we don't back down is this fear of being labelled a coward. The audience's opprobrium, should we back down and be seen as cowards, is what lands us deeply in trouble. I wonder what thoughts are about that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in that the idea of the audience is opprobrium, that it's very much a matter of how we look in the eyes of others that seems to be behind at least this classic sort of martial idea of cowardice. And he comes at that from the anthropologists and sort of evolutionary perspective. And there's a strong strain of often comic thinking in literature and the arts, where people embrace cowardice. Céline, in his World War I novel, Journey to the End of the Night, says, at least here he was with 2 million heroic madmen armed to the teeth, staring each other down. At least he had the sense to opt for cowardice, and there are other instances of that. And yeah, I mean, I think that that many a war would have been avoided had people been less afraid of being cowardly. On the other hand, I guess, and the book is sort of filled with on the other hands. One thinks, well, yeah, okay, it's true that if some weaker side had not opted for war against a stronger side, they might have gotten off better, but it's also true that they might have been utterly annihilated and enslaved, and so those calculations enter into it as well.
So one of the points you're making, I think, in the book is that actually maybe we sometimes have more to fear from people who do the opposite of cowardice. They're kind of reckless and lack fear, when a bit more fear might lead to more intelligent caution in certain situations. But I want to think about closing with another very interesting point that I think you make in the book. You highlight in a way how political, I would put it, the notion of cowardice is, which is that governments want us to fall into line and sign up for the army and not be cowards when there's a war to be fought and they're trying to sell us a war. But you talk towards the end of the book about this thing called moral courage, the moral courage perhaps to stand out from the crowd or stand up against the crowd, to be a non-conformist. And that takes great courage, and to say, no, I don't agree with this policy, or I don't support this. And through history, it's these non-conformists who had moral courage who are vindicated very often. But our governments want us to conform. They don't want us to show moral courage. And I think that's what you're kind of saying, that cowardice is a very political idea.
Yeah, and I would only slightly amend what you said, which is to say that while, of course, I admire moral courage, one of the things I argue, especially towards the end of the book, is that it's not that we necessarily have to be morally courageous, but that, which is, one of the things I say is that courage is this very exalted concept that's sort of difficult to measure, whereas cowardice, if it's measured against duty, that is what you should do, is easier to measure, easier to see, and so more useful. And so I give the examples in the book of the moral cowardice that, for instance, Primo Levi saw in the German people, who sort of went along with what was happening, and of course, in many cases, were complicit in it, and in the Holocaust, or Martin Luther King berating his audiences for their moral cowardice, for remaining silent, and so had these peoples, or even some among those people, said, no, we need to do something about this, or no, I will not continue to avert my eyes from this terrible thing, then maybe these things would never have happened. And of course, if there were some very few who did that, and that took moral courage, and those people are heroes, but their heroism would not have been necessary if we had avoided being cowardly. So it seems a bit of a fine distinction, but after I've written the book, I've come to think of it as more at the heart of what I was up to. And you'll notice I started talking about we towards the end there, in part because I don't mean to malign just the Germans or those benighted souls in America who didn't campaign for racial justice in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, or against slavery in the 1800s, but that we in our own lives today are maybe being guilty of kinds of moral cowardice. But now I'm preaching, aren't I?
Well, we're going to think about closing. Chris, thank you very much indeed. So Chris Walsh's book is entitled Cowardice, A Brief History. It's published by Princeton. And one of the points that Chris makes in the book is that actually it's surprising how little has been written about cowardice and how few are the books or the treatises on the subject. And yet when you read Chris's book, which is a very easy read but very erudite, you begin to look around you and see the world in a very different way. And you see how cowardice, or its opposite, or its reaction to cowardice, or fear of cowardice, shapes a large part of our lives, much more than you would have noticed if you hadn't read the book. So Chris Walsh's book is entitled Cowardice, A Brief History. It's published by Princeton. Chris, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. My pleasure.